Right, Scott, that's us.
Evening, folks. Thanks for coming in and welcome on this kind of damp and dark Guy Fawkes night. Hope you're all well. As normal, Sarah's here, and we've got the man himself back with us tonight, Mr. Richard Jones. Thanks very much for coming back in, Richard. How are you today or this evening?
Yeah, not bad at all. I'm enjoying my first day of lockdown.
I don't think as many people can say that, is there?
That's it. I've only just come out, and now I'm going back in.
Well, at least you. I mean, it's kind of wet and damp up here, so at least you'll be dry. That's one of the main things. Now, tonight we're just going to cover a couple of subjects, Richard, if that's okay with you. Also, there's a couple of questions that I want to ask you about Jack the Ripper that I never got to ask previously, and just to kind of touch on Guy Fawkes. Since it is Guy Fawkes night, I thought it'd be fitting to just touch upon that. So the last time you were on, brilliant chat. Everybody learned a lot, I think. A lot of things you didn't know. Two things I kept wondering after it, and I kept the questions for when I knew you were going to come back on. Hi, Chapel. Thanks for coming in, buddy. Hope you're well. One was Jack the Ripper. Do you think he came from a kind of well-to-do background? I'm asking because also he had some kind of medical training, and I would have imagined back then it would have cost, a wee bit of money to train, basically. I might be wrong, it's just something that kind of popped into my head.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that was wondered at the time. Certainly at the inquest, it was constantly brought up. Did the killers demonstrate medical knowledge? So was there any medical knowledge shown? And the newspapers, certainly at the inquest into the second victim, Annie Chapman, the coroner, Wynne Baxter, actually towards the end of the inquest said that he'd been approached by a curator from a pathological museum in London who'd been approached by an American doctor who wanted to pay a specific amount of money to collect wombs. And this was Annie Chapman's inquest when the womb had been removed from her body. That's what then started the whole thing off. Did he have medical knowledge? And Dr. George Baxter Phillips, who'd examined the body in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, where it was found, where she was found, he actually said that the fact the killer had cut out and gone off with a womb suggested to him the reason for the murder had been so the killer could acquire that particular part of her anatomy. He went on to say that, furthermore, the speed with which he did it and the skill displayed suggested to him that the killer possessed some anatomical knowledge. And this then started the newspapers, oddly, they dubbed it the Burke and Hare theory, and that it was somebody murdering to acquire body parts. So it did start this whole idea that Jack the Ripper might, in the public consciousness at least, that he might be a doctor. And so then we get this idea of the well-to-do man coming in with the top hat, the swirling cape, and the doctor's bag that he always carries with him in the films. Whether he was well-to-do, it's difficult to say. The evidence suggests that he was somebody who lived in the area. The police certainly at the time seem to have thought he was a resident of one of the many common lodging houses in the area. So that would make him...
Where did I go? Where did I go? What happened there?
I don't know.
He's in the basement, you guys. Sorry, Richard, I don't know what happened there. You disappeared.
No. Spooky.
I don't know what happened there. Sorry, my friend. We've got you back anyway, so...
It's a government conspiracy to silence me.
I probably. I don't know what happened there, sorry. You were saying...
So where did I get to? Where did you catch me to? Was it
that they thought he was probably well-to-do because of the appearance of hat and the bag and what have you?
Yeah. So you got that, but then the police were almost convinced throughout that he lived in the area, that he was lodging in one of the common lodging houses, which was the last refuge for the destitute poor before the street or the workhouse. So it's difficult to say, and. With all the suspects, quite a few of the suspects were well-to-do, people like Montague John Druitt, but then some of them were sort of living in the area, again, either were living with relatives, people like Kosminski lived in the area, So, and I know it's sitting on the fence, and I keep saying this, but it's almost impossible to say one way or the other because we don't know who he was.
Mm-hmm. But actually, I've thought of another question for you as well. So, I mean, obviously, going by what you know is the nature of his crimes and what have you. So okay, Eddie, look, my hands are there, buddy. I never kicked Richard out. Honest, wasn't me.
was that banned?
You were on a timeout. Jack had him for a few seconds. Thanks, Chapel. You know.
But I escaped his clutches.
So, what kind of childhood do you think Jack would have had? You know, going by the nature of his crimes and the brutality of them. Any ideas? Upbringing.
No, again, it's a tricky one to say. You often do get the case that a lot of, killers like this, a few of them, perhaps quite a few of them, do have a very dominant mother, or they suffer a domestic abuse, some sort of domestic violence in their childhood. And then there is a pattern. I mean, there's the classic thing that you often see in Criminal Minds and CSI with serial killers, that they start off in childhood probably torturing animals or being, bullies to others. But if it was, for example, someone like Kosminski, then his childhood would have been in Eastern Europe. And that was very violent at the time, because one of the problems with Whitechapel in 1888, one of the things with Whitechapel was you'd had this huge influx of Ashkenazi Jews who were fleeing from persecution in Eastern Europe. You had pogroms going on. I mean, what had happened was Tsar Alexander II of Russia had been assassinated in 1881, and this had sparked off the pogroms. And this had then seen the Jewish population, or a lot of Jews, fleeing the persecution and coming to the East End of London and settling in the East End of London. Their arrival coincided with a trade slump that saw massive unemployment and lack of housing in the area. And they were hardworking because by nature they were immigrants, so they were hardworking. And in consequence, they found themselves accused of stealing English jobs and English homes. And so a belief had then sprung up that everything bad, they were responsible for it. So when these killings started, of course, everyone blamed the immigrant community, as they often do.
What about, after we spoke to you the last time you were on, as I say, you told us loads and loads about Jack. I get this kind of image in my head that he was maybe, a loner as a child, not necessarily, an only child, but a kind of loner. As you say, like CSI, you see in the films and what have you, these kids that they don't like society, they just want to be alone. And that's how they grow up, and this is how their mind starts to develop kind of dark thoughts and what have you. That's the kind of impression I've got of Jack as a child, basically.
Yeah, and probably as an adult as well. I mean, if he was anybody, he was probably somebody who people didn't mix well, didn't socialize with people. He was probably somebody who everybody or lots of people probably encountered, and they thought he was a bit odd, but harmless. But every so often, the voices in his head became too much, and he would go out and kill.
Do you think maybe that people around him maybe knew who he was, but were just too scared to actually go to the police? Or maybe they didn't like the police, maybe they had something personal against the police. You think maybe that could have been a scenario?
Yeah, I mean, it's very possible that he was living with family, and the family either thought there was something wrong with him, or they knew, and they that might be what happened to him, that his family put him into an asylum, and that so they kept it quiet. And if he was well-to-do, he would have gone into a private asylum. So the family probably would have wanted to keep it quiet. There's also a possibility that the police got him, and they did put him into an asylum. But yeah, there's all sorts of scenarios of what he could have been like, and he could, as I say, he could have just been somebody that the family, they thought maybe he's a bit odd, there's something wrong with him, or they could have known. I mean, obviously, there's the Anderson's memoirs in which he states that he was a low-born Polish Jew living in the heart of the area. And he basically said, and if it was Kosminski, we know he was with his family. Whether the family knew, that's debatable. but we do know that he was then, Kosminski, when he was taken into custody, was supposedly identified by a witness, but the witness wouldn't testify because he was also Jewish and he wouldn't testify against one of his own kind. And so that's virtually what we know about Kosminski. And the only Kosminski who fits that description in the asylum records is Aaron Kosminski.
Right. I've got one more question for you, and then there's some questions in the chat as well. We've been posting your links, and I was looking at one of them the other day, and one of the comments on it was, do you think he was part of the government? I found this a kind of strange comment. I don't read it or not. I noticed it the other day, and I thought, part of a government body, or part of the actual government. So I thought I need to ask you when you're on, what you think.
Yeah, I try to post a Jack the Ripper question every night to sort of get people discussing. And I deliberately put that one up because a lot of people lately have been talking about the Michael Caine film and the From Hell film. And in both of those films, the suggestion is that it was a government conspiracy. The reason I asked, was he part of the government, was because there has been suspicion that he may have been sort of a Mason and perhaps a member of the establishment that was going out there. I mean, personally, I think it's nonsense. I mean, I don't for a minute think that he was. But many people, thanks to the films, thanks to From Hell, thanks to the Michael Caine one of 1988, a lot of people do think that it was a conspiracy, and a lot of people still to this day are convinced it was a cover-up, that the government covered it up. Personally, I don't think they did. They had no motive to cover it up. In fact, they probably had every motive to bring him to justice because it was just doing so much damage to the police.
Well, that's. I mean, it does sound a bit. Excuse me. It does sound a bit bizarre. It's a government thing. The government have sent somebody out to, murder these women and brutalise them. It does sound a bit. It's just when I seen that comment, I thought I've never ever heard that. In relevance to Jack the Ripper before, being some government person. We've got a couple of questions from the chat for you. Sarah wants to put them up, since I'm not allowed to touch the computer.
How did he evade the law and never get caught? Several possibilities. The biggest reason he evaded the law and he never got caught was because he picked the perfect opportunity to carry out his murders. That he basically chose an area where you had narrow alleyways, intricate alleyways. None of them were lit by night, so perfect escape route for him. He's gone with his victims, if you believe that they were prostitutes. Some people now believe they weren't, but if you do, his victims knew where to take him, where they weren't going to get interrupted, because that was the nature of what they did. So they could take him to places. Perfect place to carry out a murder. You've also got the fact that in the area, remember in those days, there's no refrigeration. So meat was slaughtered in the night and then sold the next morning at the butchers and the market stores. So you had a lot of butchers and slaughterers in the area who would go around in bloodstained aprons. So it wasn't uncommon to see people covered in blood or with bloodstains on them wandering around Whitechapel in the early hours of the morning. And people were used to seeing it. So the only way, as long as he can get through the alleyways and he can evade the police, then unless he's left a clue behind that says I'm such and such living at this address, then all the police can do is just hope that what they can do is flood the area with police constables, plainclothes police officers, put them in the area, and hope the next time he kills, then there's going to be a police officer around to catch him. But that never happened. And that's how he evaded law and order. And there's a very famous comment by Inspector Henry Moore, who was one of the officers in charge of the case. He worked under Aberline, but he was in charge of the case. And he spoke about, after one of the murders, and we think it's Mary Nichols' murder, but he said, after that murder, my men formed a circle around the murder site to stop people getting in and out. He said, within minutes, we found 50 people inside the circle. They'd come in through 2 passageways my men didn't even know about. So that's how intricate the area was for alleyways and escape routes.
Frankie, do you think he kept count of his victims?
That's a great question, Frankie. Again, it's difficult to say whether he did or not. I personally think he wouldn't have deliberately counted his victims, but he was certainly an opportunist killing, and he would look for the opportunity. So whenever the opportunity presented itself, then he would commit his murders. And of course, you can see that very early on. You get Mary Nichols murdered on August 31st. A week later, you've got Annie Chapman. Then they put more police in the area, so you get that gap of 2 weeks. Then he murders on the 30th of September 2 times, Elizabeth Stride Caperos. And then throughout the whole of October, there's no murders. The whole of October, 1888, no murders, because there's more police in the area. They've got lots and lots of police in the area. And then it quietens down a bit. And so he finds Mary Kelly. Mary Kelly, of course, was murdered indoors. That's the difference there. So he did have time, and he had privacy on that account. But whether he kept account of his victims, then I'm not sure. I've just made the rabbit hole get deeper. And, my work here is done. Just chaos.
That's Eddie. He's from Alaska. He's a good friend of ours. Well, everybody in the chat's a friend of ours, obviously. But Eddie, he's in Alaska, and he can get a wee bit nutty at times in a good way. You know, he's just crazy.
Yeah. I mean, that is the problem about the Jack the Ripper case. I think you hit the nail on the head there, Just Chaos. The more you dig, the more you dig yourself into a trench, because the more you explore, the more you find out, then the more strands there are, and you just find yourself following this endless thread that takes you wherever it's going to take you. So it's a brilliant observation.
Do you think he set out maybe with a plan? Right, I want to kill 5 people and then I'll be done.
No. There was talk. I talked her out, and it was after Annie Chapman's murder. Apparently, a scrawled chalk message was found on one of the walls saying, and I can't remember the exact number, but it said, "This makes 3 because Martha Tabram, 4 more, and I shall give myself up," or words to that effect. But a certain number more, and I shall give myself up. But that was probably people were chalking messages all over the area at the time. And of course, the most famous one is the graffito found on the doorway in Goulston Street. But that wasn't an isolated instance. There was graffiti appearing all over Whitechapel at the time.
Mm-hmm. I remember you speaking about that last time. On the graffiti that with Nicole, a lot of Jack the Ripper copycats.
That's another interesting question, Nicole. There certainly were. It became, and this is going to sound so bizarre, but he became almost a folk hero amongst amongst young men. And there's lots of records of women all over the country, women in Liverpool, women in the East End of London, women in Glasgow. They'll be walking home at night, and suddenly someone will jump out and say, "I'm Jack the Ripper," and pull a knife out on them and threaten them that they were going to kill them like Jack the Ripper. You had a lot of domestic violence where husbands threatened their wives with, "I'm going to do a Jack the Ripper on you," and several of them actually did murder their wives. And the last thing they said to them was, I'm going to do a Jack the Ripper. You then had, of course, the letters. You also had other murders taking place. Again, we come to the later murders. Rose Mylett in December 1888, Alice Mackenzie, Francis Coles. And again, are they by the killer we now know as Jack the Ripper, or are they copycat killings, or are they just sort of random killings? And it's tricky to say, but certainly there were imitators of Jack the Ripper, and perhaps most famously, there were imitators who imitated him by writing letters and saying they were going to do all sorts of nasty things. And we also get records in the newspapers of women committing suicide because they became that afraid of Jack the Ripper. And there's one poor girl who actually ended up being driven insane. She got a letter from Jack the Ripper, and it drove her mad, and she ended up in an asylum. So it really did have a massive impact on so many people.
I suppose that, living in that era at Whitechapel as well, and some of these mysterious were killing these women in such a brutal fashion that nobody was safe, and obviously back then they didn't have the kind of measures that we've got just now, police-wise, that kind of thing. So I think, I can imagine it would have driven a lot of fear into anybody, really.
Yeah.
Chapel's got a question for you, Richard.
Is there a chance that Jack made his way to America as theorized in H.H. Holmes documentary? I mean, there is a chance, yeah, that H.H. Holmes, I mean, whether H.H. Holmes was ever in America, ever in England, is debatable. Whether he was in London at the time, again, it's debatable. But certainly there's lots of records of Americans being picked up by the police because they recognize, that, I mean, a lot of people thought anyone who was different in the area was going to be suspected of being Jack the Ripper. H. Holmes is one. Perhaps the one who most certainly was arrested in the area and was certainly in the area at the time was, in London at the time, was Francis Tumblety, Dr. Tumblety. And he was arrested in early November, was released on bail, and then he skipped bail and went back to America. But he's not the only one. There's lots of records of Americans. And the thing to remember about London at the time was it was a busy port. It was the world's largest port. So you had lots of sailors coming in, day out. Many of them coming in. Many of the women in the area, although probably not what we would term like street prostitutes, were what were known as sailors' women. And they would, when sailors were on shore, they would become effectively their wife for the time the sailors were on shore and furloughed. And then when the sailors went back, then they'd they'd have another sailor. But so you had a lot of women who did, worked with sailors, became almost the wives of sailors. And that's the thing to remember at the time. You had so many people in the area, but you also had so many people transient through the area. You had a busy Haymarket on Whitechapel High Street. Every day farmers came in from Essex, came in from Norfolk, came in from Suffolk, bringing hay onto the Haymarket. You had the fruit and veg market at Spitalfields, and farmers and labourers came in from there. You had a lot of transient labourers coming into the area. And on top of that, you had all the sailors coming into the port. So it was a busy area. And at the height of the panic, anyone who was slightly different, who didn't sort of belong in the area, was often getting chased by the mob, accused of being Jack the Ripper. And we have record. I did a blog about this one, but there was a musician who played in the orchestra in one of the London theatres, and he played the cello. And he was walking through Whitechapel. He lived in Whitechapel, and he was on his way to, I think it was the Theatre Royal in Drury Lane. But he was walking through Whitechapel with his cello in his black case, and somebody saw it and said, "It's Jack the Ripper." And this poor cellist found himself pursued by the mob, and he had to be rescued by the police.
I think there would have been a lot of hysteria and, paranoia going about at that time. So, probably anybody dressed, in a similar fashion to what Jack the Ripper was would be a kind of target. I think their eyes would have been, going all kind of directions, trying to watch out.
And the other thing that we get records of is we get women who, or prostitutes, who were blackmailing clients. So they might go to take a client to, let's say, somewhere around one of those back streets, and then when they had the client learn, they'd say, "Look, if you don't hand over more money, I'm going to start screaming and say you're Jack the Ripper," and so you get that, you get the extortion element coming into it. So it's when the murder stopped, what were the reasons they gave why they stopped? They never gave a reason. I'm assuming, Nicole, you mean that the police gave. What reason did the police give? They didn't, because the thing is, we only know the murders stopped because we have hindsight, so we can look back and say that's when they stopped. At the time, the police didn't know they'd stopped, and so again, we get the later Whitechapel murders. You then get murders happening all over the country, all over the world, actually, that are linked to the Ripper murders throughout the 1890s. It's 1892 appears to be the time that they decided that there hadn't been any murders now for over a year. And that's when they seem to have realized that the criminal had stopped. But I don't think they ever gave a reason why they'd stopped. They just thought they've stopped. And the reason they did stop was because something happened to the killer. And it was either that he died, went to prison, went to an asylum, or went somewhere else, or retired, which is unlikely because killers like this don't retire. They carry on until they're caught. But so something certainly happened. But the police at the time, as far as they were concerned, they were pursuing the murderer. And probably it was maybe 1895, 1896 before they could say with a degree of certainty that the murders had stopped. And there's the Chief Constable of Scotland Yard in 1894, Sir Melvin Macnaghten, or Melvin Macnaghten as he was at the time. He became Sir Melvin Macnaghten, but he actually wrote the Macnaghten Marginalia, a memorandum in which he says that the reason the killing stopped was because his prime suspect was Montague John Druitt, and he committed suicide in November 1888. So that's why they stopped. But as I say, that's the only real reason we get why the murder stopped from the police themselves. Anyone else when we do it today, we're looking back and saying, well, they stopped for a specific reason. And it depends who you think the suspect was as to why they stopped. Or if you don't think it was the suspect, they stopped because something happened to him.
So that's why I was asking about the number 5. Maybe, it's just a theory. They did set out with a plan to kill, 5 women, and then it was done, for some, unknown reason, basically. To say it was just a theory. Maybe this was going through his head at the time. Because I think, obviously never caught, so nobody knows who really was. So people can't. This is just my opinion, Richard. Obviously, as I say, he was never caught, so nobody knew who he was. So nobody could actually ever determine what was actually in his head. Why? Did they have a plan? Did they just plan 5? Was the number 5 significant? Why was could it have something to do with his childhood? I think it's that big a case. There's that many different theories and possibilities to who he was, where he came from, everything. Yeah, I've got this image in my head. There's just a big mound of paperwork, with all the facts and figures on it, and try to decipher it would be kind of incredible, I think.
Yeah, it would be wonderful if we could today have all the police. We haven't got them anymore, but if we just had the police notebooks, the police might well have encountered it. Also, at the time, Charles Booth was doing his famous poverty map of London, and his researchers were in the area. Those books have survived, and they were literally interviewing people. They were interviewing the police. They were interviewing local residents. They were going around sort of saying where the poorest parts of London were, what the crime was like in the area. And it's, he might have even been interviewed by one of them. One of them might have encountered him, but we just don't know. And that's the thing, as you say rightly. Everyone's opinion. Everyone can have an opinion, because it's not like established historical fact that we can say anything's right and anything's wrong. It's just everything's valid, basically.
Yeah, everything's just based on sort of recorded facts that happened back then. So obviously everybody's going to take a kind of different reading of each individual case, etc. But there's Nicole, another question. Then we got a question for you from Frankie GP. But was there a second ago? Where'd it go? There is it.
Were there unsolved murders linked to the Jack the Rippers or assumed linked? Well, of course, all the Jack the Ripper murders were unsolved. So the later murders, certainly Alice Mackenzie, were in some people's minds linked to Jack the Ripper. Earlier murders, Martha Tabram's murder on August the 7th, 1888, Emma Smith's murder on April the 3rd, 1888. They were linked in there. And if you look back through the newspapers, you get a few earlier attacks in February. You get the attack on a lady whose name I've just completely forgotten, but she lived at Mile End, and she was attacked by a man indoors who she'd obviously invited him into a house, and he pulled a knife and tried to cut her throat. And that might. So again, it's a question of just looking through the papers and thinking, are there sort of early attacks that could have been the work of Jack the Ripper? But again, it's difficult to say, because all the Jack the Ripper murders are unsolved, Nicole. And at the time, you've got murders in America, you've got murders in Spain, Portugal, Dominica throughout the 1890s, and they're all linked to Jack the Ripper as well. 9 times out of 10, they caught the killer. And you did have several killers who, Frederick Deeming's a classic example, who tried to claim he was Jack the Ripper, but we think he might have been doing it to sort of buy himself some time whilst he tried to get himself out of the. He'd been arrested for murder and trying to buy time. Then, of course, you get suspects like Dr. Neil Cream, who's supposedly on the gallows just before the rope fell, was supposed to have said, "I'm Jack the," and then the trap fell and killed him. So we never know what he was going to say. "I'm Jack the whatever."
And then it was gone.
Yep.
It's Frankie GP, sorry, is asking, do you think the Whitechapel areas are haunted?
Oh, do you know? I mean, there are lots of ghost stories about the area around Whitechapel. The Ten Bells pub, for example, that's a very spooky pub, and that's got several ghosts inside it. We've got the murder site of Mary Nichols. William Stewart wrote a book in the 1930s where he claimed that Jack the Ripper was a midwife abortionist in that book, that it was Jill the Ripper. But he claimed that her ghostly figure appeared on the site in Bucks Row where she was murdered. You've also got Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square. That's supposedly the outline of her body supposed to appear on the anniversary of her death on the 30th of September. And then where Annie Chapman was murdered, that became part of the Truman Brewery. And supposedly on the anniversary of Annie Chapman's death, the boardroom of the brewery would become icy cold. That's what the security guards used to tell when they used to catch free drinks in the local pubs. But we do have one site, interesting enough, the entrance into Mitre Square as it used to be. It's now changed an awful. It's just been rebuilt. And they've put modern buildings up around mine. Well, they were modern then, but they're even more modern now. But there was one part on the Jack the Ripper tours in that entrance to Mitre Square when we stopped there. We had more people faint there than anywhere else on the tour, and it was always in the same spot on that entrance into Mitre Square. So, yes, Frankie. A long-winded answer to your question, but yes, there are parts there haunted.
That's quite bizarre, that they faint on the exact same spot. That's quite.
Yeah, and it's always in the same one. We've got you. Well, it's not happened since they redeveloped the square. So I don't know if it was something about the atmosphere there or whatever. But no, it doesn't. The square's quite wide. It's been widened now, so maybe it was just something about it. But it was it was always in that little entrance going into the square. Oh, when did you become interested in Jack the Ripper and why? From Nicole. I became interested in Jack the Ripper in the early 1980s, and I got to him through Charles Dickens. My interest was Charles Dickens, and Dickens spent a lot of time in Whitechapel. And in fact, had Dickens not died in 1870, he probably would have turned up on the list of suspects by now, because he was fascinated by prostitution and he spent a lot of time in Whitechapel. But he was long dead by the time the Ripper murders happened, 18 years after his death. So it was Dickens doing Whitechapel. As you start to look into the Dickens, Henry Mayhew, and the social conditions, inevitably the Jack the Ripper crimes come into it, because they had such an impact on the social conditions in the area. And when I started looking into them, my first thought was it's just going to be gruesome murders. I'm not that interested in gruesome murders as such. But then I suddenly realized that this sequence of murders, they weren't just about murder. They were about victims. They were about conditions. They were about mob mentality, what happens when the mob goes wild. And in fact, I was going to do a blog earlier on this year because this is the first media murderer. So the first time a murderer is reported in the mass media all over the world. And I was going to do a blog in March called "What Jack the Ripper Taught Me About COVID," because or coronavirus, simply because the media, of course, they always. You don't really sell newspapers by reporting nice stories. You sell newspapers if you terrify people, and the media did it early this year, and they do it, and they did it with Jack the Ripper. And they discovered with Jack the Ripper, the more gruesome you make it, the more sinister, the more terrifying you make it, the more newspapers you'll sell. And that was fascinating as well, because you can actually watch newspapers realizing throughout the Jack the Ripper murders that the more they report on the murders, the more copies they'll sell. And you can see that happening as well. So what interested me, the reason why, was because there were just so many strands to it, so many threads that you could follow. And I just think that is fascinating. You can come in from any angle and find some interest in Jack the Ripper.
Exactly. As you say, you know, the newspapers kind of caught on to the fact that the more kind of blood, you know, the more gore, the more sales, basically. And I think that's the same. I mean, I'm a big horror film fan, and I like a horror. Tell you, I like a horror film with plenty of people getting butchered. Basically, you know, I know it sounds quite dark, but I've always been a big if there's a horror film, there's a lot of blood and guts in it, as I say, and another mild one, I'll go for the blood and guts one.
Yeah.
You know, so I imagine it's the same newspaper-wise.
That's very much so. I mean, if you think about, take terrorism, for example. If you take terrorism, a terrorist attack, if you say like maybe 2-3 people killed in a terrorist attack, but if on that same day, probably 50-60 people would have died from an asthma attack. And yet, if the newspapers report, oh, such and such man dies from asthma attack, it's not going to have the same impact as man murdered in a terrorist attack. And you've probably got more danger in London. When there's terrorism, you get, if you think about how the news covers it, wall-to-wall news coverage, they'll set up on the periphery. When the London Bridge attacks, for example, you saw the cameras there, and they kept showing that same footage of everyone running away, and that, of course, gets into the consciousness, and it terrifies you more. Yet probably the more people die from breathing the air in London because it's so polluted than actually died in terrorist attacks. And yet it's something we don't get. It doesn't have the same impact, and the newspapers know what has impact. And what has impact is something that's sudden, something that's violent. And as with horror films, it's that something. It's like when you see them in a horror film and they see the house, the car breaks down and they see the house on the hill and they go, oh, let's go to that house. And you see it, they go, no, don't. It can only end up badly. It's going to end up bad.
Just when you mentioned the bridge attacks, I was down in London the week after it.
Yeah.
After the Westminster attacks, and I was living in Putney. I was staying with a friend in Putney, and I went out to the city one day, and I got off at Westminster, and I was one of the first things I did was walk over to the bridge, just to have a look. You know, I wasn't being morbid or anything like that, but because I'd saw it that many times in the news over the previous few days, as soon as I came out of the station, I went straight over the bridge, and you're looking about, you know, this is where it happened, basically. And it's quite a scary feeling, actually, you know, just after the attacks. Yeah. Even though I'm from Glasgow, you're walking about London, and you know yourself, Reggie, it was wall-to-wall police. Everywhere I went, there was police everywhere. But you still get this feeling of, you know, dread kind of thing. You're still looking over your shoulder every 2 minutes, sort of, you know, in case something else is going to happen. Comparing that to Whitechapel, do you think maybe a lot of people would have felt that way back then during Jack's kind of era, sort of thing?
Very much so. You can see it on the in how the newspapers report on what's happening. They report certainly after Annie Chapman's murder, the streets are empty at night. People don't go out onto the streets. People are terrified to go out on the streets. And then gradually nothing happens. And you can see this with terrorist attacks. People become frightened to go into London. And then gradually they get a bit more confident. With Jack the Ripper, they got a bit more confident. They'd go out and then they start going out. And then, of course, then you get another crime. And the thing about the Jack the Ripper ones is you had 5 very violent murders happen in a very short period of time. It's, 11, 12 weeks. So with terrorist attacks, horrible as they are, you know, there's time. I remember the tube bombings, 2005, when the bombers went off, and that, of course, Aldgate Station was in the East End of London. And I remember the day after, I walked down Whitechapel Road, and you could feel the tension. And thereafter, on the tube, you could feel the tension on the tube. And if somebody got on with a rucksack, you could see everyone's eyes, and then the number of people who get out of the carriage and wait on the platform. And then gradually people sort of get used to it, and it's
I know exactly the feeling. I don't know if you remember the Glasgow airport attacks. With the Jeep. Well, at that time I was working. I didn't have a car, so I got a bus every day. So that attack happened, on the Saturday, and on the Monday I was going to work, and I was sitting in the bus, and it was the same bus I got every day. You know, the same people. You got to know these people because you see them 5 days a week. There was another 2 guys sitting with me, they worked in the same kind of area as me. But this other guy got on with a rucksack, and he sat beside us, and it must have been maybe a good 30 minutes of journey for when he got to where we got off. And the entire time, we the threes were just sitting, staring at, well, not staring at the guy, but watching him like a hawk, you know. Yeah. And we got off the bus at the same stop. One of the guys says to me, if he'd taken out a mobile phone, he was, you know, and the way they say in Glasgow, he was getting it. If he'd put out a mobile phone, I was going to jump on him. So, you know, and so, yeah, I mean, the guy was just an innocent guy going to his work. But I think because he had the rucksack and he came onto a bus, everybody sort of, you know, and everybody just kind of focused, you know, on this guy. Another question I've got for you is, now this was in the programme Whitechapel, and somebody had said that they reckon, is it Whitechurch, an area?
Whitechurch. There was Backchurch Lane, and there was a lane called Backchurch Lane.
They reckon this was a gateway to hell. You know,
Whitechurch Lane. Yeah. Basically, I mean, because the other thing was you had the area around Spitalfield, because you had different communities living in the area as well. And one of the most infamous communities was you had a big Irish community living over St. George's in the east, and Whitechurch Lane. Was it Whitechurch Lane or Backchurch Lane? But I think it's Whitechurch. But anyway, one of them did lead into that area, and that area was notorious for fights and for drunken brawls and fighting and the violence around there. But no, I mean the whole area. I mean Whitechapel. The whole area of Whitechapel had, and largely it was an undeserved reputation. You had, like any city, you had certain little pockets of the area of Whitechapel that were violent, nasty areas. But most of Whitechapel, they lived very respectable lives, and probably more respectable than the wealthier people in the West End of London. Oh, some people in the West End of London. But again, it's the newspapers focused on nothing good can ever come out of Whitechapel. And so that became the image. And you had people like Samuel Barnett, the Reverend Samuel Barnett, who was in the area at the time. And you had him saying, look, Whitechapel's reputation, it's undeserved. It's not that bad. You get a lot of people live respectably in Whitechapel, and a lot of people are fairly well off, well-to-do. There were poor people there, but there were parts of London that were far worse than Whitechapel. Notting Hill Gate, Marylebone, Southwark. But because of the Ripper murders and because that focused press attention on the area, Whitechapel got the rap, and that's why Whitechapel got its reputation.
I suppose it's like a lot of areas, still to this day, it still happens. You got an area with a bad reputation. I assumed whether unsolved murders like to Jack the Ripper or assumed links. I don't know why that's popped back up again, Richard. Sorry about that.
No idea.
Said that one, didn't you? So it says like all areas, Glasgow's got quite a bad reputation, for violence and whatever, but there's areas in Glasgow that have got a reputation for violence, but inside that area, there's really nice people living in it.
Yeah.
And you say to somebody, where are you from? And they say, oh, Easterhouse. I say, go away, I'm not coming near you. You go about stabbing people. And, the person could be a regular churchgoer. So, I suppose it is still like, that society's way of thinking to this day.
Yeah.
So if anybody's got any more questions for Richard on Jack the Ripper, then if you stick them in the comments, because I want to move on. Just while waiting any other comments, Richard. Now, say you're in London, and we know, you're now in a lockdown. So obviously this is going to affect you with your tours, etc. So what's your plans? Have you got anything kind of set out, a backup plan for lockdown?
Well, I'm going to increase the virtual tours. So I'm going to do a lot more virtual tours. I'm also doing a daily parody diary on Samuel Pepys, which is called The Diary of Richard Pepys. So I'm living in Seething Lane with Donald Trump as my neighbour in my diary, and Joe Biden's moved in opposite, and I've got Boris Johnson keeps coming around to see me. I keep getting run over by Dominic Cummings in his carriage because he's testing his eyesight. He can't.
I think Sarah's got the link for that anyway, so she can pop that into the chat if everybody wants to give us a wee look up.
That's a good. Are there any other serial killers you investigate, or just Jack the Ripper? To be honest, I investigate other serial killers only in the way that they are linked to Jack the Ripper. I.e., people like H.H. Holmes or other killers like Neil Cream. And I investigate purely simply because they are Jack the Ripper suspects, and so I mean, my interest really isn't in serial killers, so I'm not an expert on the psychology of a serial killer. My interest is in the murders and how they impacted on society. So it's the history of the crimes as opposed to the actual crimes themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. It does make sense. House prices have gone up.
A fantastic question, Frankie. Interestingly enough, a lot of people who've now bought houses in the area are trying to distance themselves from any links with each other. They don't like the tours, for example, going into Whitechapel. They feel that it sort of belittles the area. And the interesting thing is, a lot of the streets that are now so poverty-stricken, were so poverty-stricken, now the houses there, they're going for over $1 million, north of 1.3, 1.2 million to buy one of the big, and they are big houses. I mean, these are the houses, some of them were the common lodging houses, could house 300 people in these houses. So for a family home, right on the doorstep of the city, it's fantastic. But of course, the people who can afford that sort of price are not the sort of people who, and it's quite bizarre, Whitechapel is actually, especially the area around Spitalfields, because you have these £1 million houses where stockbrokers and media people and journalists live. But you've still got, I mean, this is going to sound like a very bizarre story, but I was taking a couple round about 3 weeks ago, and we were just walking around. I was telling them about Jack the Ripper, and we were walking, and I was talking about these £1 million houses. And so I thought, that's £1 million house. And just as we rounded the corner past one of them, there's 3 junkies sat on the doorstep of this £1 million house injecting. And they looked up as we came around the corner and said, "Oh, very sorry about this." And it was just they were shooting up, but they were just so polite about, "Oh, very sorry about this." And it was the most incredible thing. But I always remember I took a chap round. It wasn't a Jack the Ripper tour that he booked me to. It was a Jewish East End tour, and I was taking him down Fournier Street, and he said, "Yeah," he said that house. He said, "I grew up in that house." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "I grew up in there. I was there in the 50s, 60s. He said, "Our landlord offered my father the house." He said to my dad, he said, he said, "I want to sell you the house." He said, "I just need to get rid of the house." And he said, "Oh." And he said, "Look," he said, "you don't even need to get a mortgage." He said, "I'll let you work. The rent can be your mortgage." He said, "I just want to be shot of the house." And he said, "My dad said to the landlord, 'Nah, who'd want to live around here?'" And he was going to sell it to him for £12,000. and it's now 1.4 million. And he's
that's unbelievable. That's really, really unbelievable.
Yeah. I mean, 30 years ago, you would not want to live around there. When I started the tours in 1982, it was still a very rough area, and you still had, there was still quite a few prostitutes in the area. And I always remember my favorite thing was to point out to the groups was that the prostitutes used to stand by the speed bumps because the cars had to slow down to go over the speed bumps. So they had a reason to the way through the window.
Drivers would get a better look or something.
That's it.
I mean,
Yeah.
think about it does kind of make sense, to stand there, because that's where the cars stop, to get over. So, I suppose.
And they were such characters as well. I mean, they funnily enough, they used to drink in the 10 Bells, and so you'd often encounter them in the 10 Bells, because in those days Spitalfields Market was still a wholesale market, so you still had the truck drivers coming in during the night, and that formed a large portion of the clientele for them. And I always remember I'd go in there, You get to chat with them, when you in one of your groups. I always remember going with the groups, and the ladies would be in there, and they'd shout over, "Oi, love, same again tonight later." Then
you just imagine them sitting there with their accent, what have you, and then the guy sitting there just looking, and the whole pub kind of, just kind of closing in on him as he's sitting. I mean. But I like the idea of the speed. Not I'm going to try it, just kind of thing. It does make perfect sense. So I never actually asked you the last time, Richard, about your actual tour. How long does your tour, last, and what have you? How much many areas do you kind of cover in it?
It's the tour itself's £12 per person, and it's 2 hours. So it's a 2-hour tour. And we cover the area. We start off at Aldgate East. So we start close to where the Whitechapel itself used to be. That was St. Mary's Church, and that was lime washed in the Middle Ages. So that became known as the Whitechapel, and that was where the names of the area came from. But that's where Emma Elizabeth Smith was. She met the men who attacked her by that church. And then we go off down Gunthorpe Street, where Martha Tavern was murdered. Then we come to Thrall Street, which is where Mary Nichols was living. And then we go off to Annie Chapman's murder site on Hanbury Street, and then come around. We jump a bit out of sequence then, because Mary Kelly's murder is between the double murder. So we do hers, and then we do a bit about Elizabeth Stride. We don't visit Mary Nichols or Elizabeth Stride's murder site, but we finish in Mitre Square. Now, funnily enough, the difference between that and the virtual tours is, on a virtual tour, you're not limited to where you can go, and you're not limited to stay in the modern age as well. So you can use all the photographs to actually move around every Whitechapel murder site, and also to go back in time as well, because you can use the old photographs to give the idea of what the streets were like. So you can look at the street on virtual now on camera, and then suddenly that same view as it was in 1888 appears before you. So that's it's one of the advantages of the virtual tours over the physical tours.
Have we got all the links there for Richard's? And we've got all those, so we can pop them up. In the chat, and get them up on Facebook as well. So I know you're kind of limited for time, Richard. Still, obviously that being Guy Fawkes night, as I said to you earlier on, right out of my head. Don't know why. Even though fireworks been popping for about 2 weeks here. Just want to touch a wee bit on Guy Fawkes. Sarah actually asked me now, to be honest with you, I don't know a lot about Guy Fawkes. I know you get the bonfire, the fireworks, penny for the guy, if they still do that kind of thing. Sarah was asking me earlier on in the car about fireworks, how they're connected to Guy Fawkes.
I think it's just really the celebration of it. It's, what we're celebrating on Guy Fawkes night is we're celebrating the fact that King James the First was, and Parliament was spared, because of course the idea what happened was, it was the Gunpowder plot was intended to blow up Parliament and blow up the Houses of Parliament. Well, not the House of Parliament, but Parliament itself, which was then the Palace of Westminster. It was all burnt down in the 19th century and rebuilt into the one we have today in the 1850s. But at the time, James I was meant to be opening Parliament, and a group of Catholic noblemen led by Robert Catesby, or Robin Catesby as it was his actual name, but he had a house over in Lambeth, and that's where they plotted it. And the idea was to then put gunpowder under the Houses of Parliament, and then at the time of when James I came to open Parliament, the idea was to blow Parliament up. They just felt that James, of course, was James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. And they thought because he was Mary Queen of Scots' son, he would have Catholic sympathies and bring Catholicism back. And when he didn't, then they became disillusioned, and they planned to kill him. What they needed, though, was an expert who understood explosives. And that's when they recruited a soldier called Guido Fawkes. And it was Guido Fawkes who then got the gunpowder, stored it under the palace, and was going to blow the palace up. But somebody tipped off Lord Monteagle, sent him a letter saying, "Do not attend the house on this night." he then notified the authorities. An extra search was made, and they found Guido Fawkes guarding the barrels of gunpowder. And he was then arrested, taken to the Tower, tortured horribly. I mean, you can see it in the signature he gives when he signs his confession. That his bones, his joints have been completely disjointed. He's been stretched on the rack and everything. And he was then executed. He wasn't burned. He was executed. But funnily enough, we burn him in effigy to celebrate the fact that Parliament spared. Funnily enough, in 1888, they burnt effigies of Jack the Ripper yeah. And they also burnt effigies of Sir Charles Warren, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, because he was so unpopular. So people had guys, Jack the Ripper guys.
The Guy Fawkes he was hung, drawn, and quartered. Am I right?
Yes. So yeah, it's a bit vicious. But I mean, by that time, it was probably a welcome release for him because he'd been tortured so much. And of course, then they hunted down the conspirators. The conspirators fled London, the majority of them, but they hunted them down to their homes and or to their hiding places. And one by one, they were either arrested or they died resisting arrest. And brought to London, but it was, but it came very close to being successful. I mean, that's the thing. It came very close to actually achieving it, but it was just the thing that was needed to sort of really stamp down on Catholicism, and so a lot of Catholics were then persecuted because of that. And of course, there's places, I think it's Lewes in Sussex, but where they have the big bonfire night parade, and they carry the Pope in effigy. A lot of places burn the Pope. Well, an effigy of the Pope.
People tend to burn a lot these days, don't they?
They do. I think we always have, because I mean the thing about this as well was. It came around the time of the Samhain, the Celtic or the Celtic change of year, and that was the period where the summer ended and you went into the winter months. So that's the period of light festivals. So it fireworks and bonfires fed perfectly into the idea of the light festivals, and that's well, of course now it's bonfire nights tends to be a bit usurped by Halloween nowadays. Of course, Halloween is originated in the Samhain. It wasn't. It's often said that Halloween was stolen by the church, the Christian church, but it wasn't. I mean, Halloween's always been a Christian festival. But what they did was the Catholic or the Christian church understood that the best way to win people over is not to stamp on their religion. The best way to win people over is to assimilate their beliefs into your religion. So they assimilated the Samhain. They had to obviously give it their own name. So they created the concept of All Hallows Day, which is November the 1st, and of course that made the night before All Hallows Eve, or All Hallows Eve, or Hallow Evening, or Halloween.
Yeah. Right. Well, I know you're limited for time, Richard. So I'm just going to tell people, as we were talking earlier on about the Tudors. What's happening, guys, is we're going to be getting Richard back again, and we're going to be doing a Tudor special live. And feel free to come along, ask Richard whatever questions you want, as long as he's okay with it, obviously. But check out all of Richard's links. They're all in the chat, or you'll find them on our Facebook page as well. So if you just can hang on a wee second or two, Richard, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So thanks very much for coming in, everybody. We'll be back on Saturday night with Natalie from Ghost Ramblers. And take care and enjoy the rest of your bonfire night, whatever's left of it, and stay safe, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Oh, fantastic.
And there's our fireworks from us to use.
Is that the view from your window?
No.
I wish.